Hello everyone, I'm Sarthak, and today we are going to learn how do you reply against d4 players. In general, d4 players have three kind of ways to play. First is they can play d4, and my reply, what I'm suggesting is to play d5. And now here onwards, you can play one bishop f4, which is called as the London system. The second choice that they can go for is c4, which is called the Queen's Gambit. And the third choice is to not play d4 at all, just play knight f3 first. And after you play d5, then they can go d4. Now, this can change into London setup, or it can also change to Queen's Gambit, depending on the situation. We start with d4, d5. And suppose if someone plays bishop to f4, now this is called as the London system. And my suggestion that against any London player, you should just directly hit in the center. The idea is to play pawn to c5, develop the knight on f6, and bring the queen on b6, pressurizing on the d4 square. At the same time, we are looking at the b2 square. Now here, if someone is playing pawn c3 or pawn e3, it means they're going for the normal London. So we can go for knight f6, pawn c3, queen b6. And here the idea is we are trying to target on this pawn. So many times I have seen players play queen to b3, or they can also play queen to c2. If they play queen to b3, you should not take it. Rather, you should push the pawn, allow them to take you so that you can take back. And if I start developing the pieces in this particular manner, bishop e2, pawn b5, the idea is to bring the knight from f6 to d7 to b6 to a4 to start attacking the b2 pawn. And this is a closed structure, which is beneficial in a lot many ways. By the way, there's a small tactic to play rook a2 and win the pawn, but don't go for that. Otherwise, suppose if I just make a random move, it's not recommended to go for that. Otherwise, we'll be losing our bishop in the end. So it's a better way to just bring knight here. And suppose if they're not careful enough, if they are playing something like some random move, just to illustrate like pawn g3, now we can make the same tactic work, rook a2. So obviously they can castle here. And in that case, we can just focus on our normal development. The idea is to play this, that, this, and pressurize on b2 pawn. After c3, queen b6, they can also go for queen to c2 line, for which I recommend knight c6, knight f3. And then there's a crazy sacrifice, bishop f5. The idea is if they take, we can go queen b2, hitting the rook, trying to go for some checkmate ideas. But generally, we are trying to hit the rook here, and we are winning the rook for a bishop, which is again fine. After queen b6, if they play something like knight to d2, then I don't recommend to take the pawn. Just focus on our normal development, which is bishop f5, pawn e6, knight c6, play normal chess, will be always fine. After d4, d5, bishop f4, pawn c5, this is called as the acceleration. Now here, suppose if someone plays knight to c3, this variation is called as the Jobava London setup. The idea is to play knight to b5, knight to c7 to hit the king and hit the rook. My reply to Jobava players is just to play a very calm pawn a6. a6 covers the b5 square, and then again focus on the same development idea, knight to f6, queen to b6, bring the knight to c6, or d7, bring the bishop to f5, pawn e6, and play normal chess. Now here, I'm not trying to make you guys memorize every single variation. I'm just trying to give you guys a normal general idea of how do you develop your pieces against specific openings so that you can have a decent middle game, at least an equal middle game to play forward. Let's play pawn e3, knight f6, knight to f3, queen to b6. Now again, it looks like we are winning a pawn, but I never recommended to take the b2 pawn. It's called as a poison pawn variation, by the way. The idea is they can play pawn a3, and if you try to be greedy by going queen b2, they can play something like knight a4, and the queen is trapped. The queen has no squares. So you can think of, after pawn a3, just bring the bishop out, bishop e2. Now again, we can think of that, am I winning a pawn or not? So I don't think so that we are winning a pawn, because after that, knight a4, queen c2, bishop c2, hitting the knight. The knight can jump very nicely on c5. It can also try to trap the rook, and the rook has no squares to go. Suppose if we play something like rook a7, we have bishop a8, and the rook is very beautifully trapped on the a7 square. Okay, so what's a better way to play? After bishop f5, bishop e2, just focus on normal chess. Play knight c6, bishop e7, castle, bring the rook on the c file, and you will be having a decent game. Now, the second way white can play is d4, d5, c4, the queen's gambit. And against queen's gambit, the reply is that we have to go is called as Slav defense. Now, Slav defense is generally achieving the structure of d5 and c6, support the center pawn by a non-center pawn. Now, they can play takes. It's called as the exchange Slav, in which you have to take back the pawn. The idea is you are having a pawn back in the center. Then you can play normal chess by playing knight f6, bishop f5, c6, and again, you won't be having too much problems. Usually white plays knight c3, in which you have to play knight f6, or they can also play knight f3, to which again will play knight f6, the same idea. They can play knight c3 now, and on the fourth move, if you will count right away, that white has played 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 moves. So on the fourth move, we want to just capture the pawn on the c4 square. Now this variation is called as the Alapin variation. And here, what I have seen, white replies by playing pawn a4, which is the main line, but not always they do that. They can play something like pawn e3 or pawn e4 because they want to take the pawn directly. So here, if they don't play pawn a4, you always play pawn b5 to support the pawn, always. So suppose if they play pawn e3, I'll play b5 to support it. If they play pawn e4, I'll play b5 again to support it. If they play bishop out, I'll play b5 again to support it. Whatever they play, if they play g3, I'll play b5 again to support it. Whatever they play, if they're not playing a4, I'll play b5. Now, again, after a4, I cannot play b5 because takes, and knight takes pawn. Now, this pawn is also weak, and I have lost the pawn on b5. So usually, after pawn a4, we play bishop to f5, pawn e3, pawn e6, bishop takes, bishop b4, castles, knight e2, knight to d7, knight to g3, hitting the bishop, bishop g6 back, bishop to d2. Now you can even take here, or if they don't play bishop d2, if they play something like pawn to b3 to bring the bishop out on b2, you can take the pawn break by playing pawn c5, pawn take pawn, takes, queen e2. And in Slav defense, generally white avoids a queen trade, but if they trade queens, it is slightly in favor of black. So queen e2, now we can play something like knight e4, takes, bishop e2, and the game will continue. We can realize that nobody has a pawn in the center, and black has all the pieces, all the minor pieces, especially nicely developed. The queen likes to go via a5 or b6. Both the rooks will be sitting nicely on the d file and c file, depending on the situation. And the game will be going on very nicely. Suppose if they play pawn e3, you go b5, and now they say, you know what, I forgot about playing a4, so I'll play a4 now. But it's too late because I can play b4, knight can go back to a2 or b1, whichever square they go. If they go knight e2, try to hit me back, support your pawn with the pawn. This knight is very bad. I'm giving the c4 pawn to the opponent, which is fine. The idea is to play e6, castles, bishop e7. You can always play bishop a6 to exchange with this bishop. Rook e1, bishop a6, takes. And again, we'll be having c5, castle, and this knight is not seeing the daylight in the near future. So for the knight to be developed, they have to play something like bishop to d2, knight to c1, knight to d3, or knight to b3. And it will take some time for white to maneuver the knight towards the center. That's all about if they don't play a4, if they don't play a4 directly. Let's go back. Again, d4, d5, c4, c6. Now suppose knight f3, knight f6, bishop 4. Now here they can play knight to d2. You can play bishop f5. The idea is to play pawn to e6, bishop out on b4 and castles. And again, we'll be having a very nice game. We can also see that we are having 1, 2, 3, 4 pawns on the queen side as compared to the 2 pawns from the white side. So it's 4 versus 2 majority pawn structure on the queen side. So whenever we are having a majority on one side with the pawns, the idea is to always push the majority and try to create passes as fast as possible. So we can play a5, knight to d7, knight b6, knight d5, and we'll be having very nice games. So just to revise quickly, so if d4, d5, bishop f4 happens, now you have to remember this is not a queen's gambit. So you should not play c6, we should play c5 here. This is called as the acceleration. And the idea is to play knight f6, queen b6, knight c6, bishop f5, pawn e6, bishop e7, castles. This is a general plan. If they play queen's gambit, then the idea is to play Slav defense. And in the Slav defense, on the 4th move, we will capture on the c4 square, just to illustrate the point. This is the 4th move, we'll capture. Now here you have to remember that white needs to play pawn to a4 to stop us from playing b5. And if white is not playing a4 at all, if white is playing something else, we will always play b5. So this is a general plan. Now let's go back. I mentioned that they can also start with knight f3 here. After knight f3, we don't know what they're doing. We don't know if they're trying to shift to the London system or if they're trying to shift to the queen's gambit. So we'll just play d5. Just wait and watch kind of a situation. d4 from white. Again, we are not so sure if they're going to play queen's gambit or if they're going to play the London system. So we'll just develop the knight to f6. Now here is where white needs to take a decision. So white decides to play bishop to f4. So it is the London, so we'll play c5. And if white decides to play c4, it's a queen's gambit, so we'll play c6. And this is just the introduction of how do you reply against London system or how do you reply against queen's gambit. Let me know if you like this introductory video. And if you want more of it, I can go into the specifics of Slav defense and I can show you some examples as well. And that's it from my side. And thank you. Keep playing. Bye-bye.